invitation and their warm hospitality. I can't but brief comment on Sir Howard's presentation before and on his economic weather map. This is, we all understand, this is a Northern European ploy, because you found a way to put the sun in the north, and to put all the clouds and the rain in the south, for once. So we all know why you did it. The truth of the matter is that the south, and I'll speak for Greece, has had a very, very bad weather. It's been a very bumpy ride. I think the last year has been a finance minister's nightmare, if you're Greek. So what I will try to do in the short time period is to give you a sense of what we went through, where we're at, more importantly where we're going, and to intertwine the Greek story with what I think is a broader story about the Eurozone and the European Union. Oh, a little bit over a year ago, we won a landslide victory in elections, and we were immediately faced with some very, very pressing problems. The most important one, was the realization that we were in a terrible fiscal mess. Remember, the 2009 budget was projecting a deficit under 3%. A few days before the election, the reported deficit to the European Commission was 6%. We realized it was over 12%. And actually, even after the final revision by Eurostat to the numbers, which will validate the Greek numbers for 2009 once and for all, it will be above 15%. We're talking about a 5-fold difference. Next to that, of course, was the alarming rate of increase in the Greek public debt, above 100 and increasing very, very rapidly. Because for a long time, the Greek economy was at the razor's edge. It had enough growth to be able to just sustain its debt to GDP ratio. Once that very delicate balance was disturbed, all hell broke loose. Next to the fiscal challenges, and the word challenge perhaps is a bit of an understatement here, you had the broader, much more structural, longer-term competitiveness problems that have been bedeviling the country for a long time. We all know that we have a bloated public sector. We all know that competitiveness has been eroding for a very long time. Product market regulation, labor market regulation, bureaucracy, a system of patronage, corruption, all these were very well documented and very clear to see for all in most international organizations' rankings. So these problems, for many years, were simply hiding under the carpet and were happily going along with some attempts at reforms, but clearly not enough to change the trend. But perhaps the most important challenge, and the one that was most damaging and most difficult for a new government, was the credibility deficit. We were at a point where nobody believed Greek numbers, nobody believed Greek policies, nobody believed any Greek government. So we were faced with what actually ended up being a race against time, and a race against a very rapidly closing window in international markets. 20 days after we took power, I submitted to Parliament a budget with a 4 percentage point reduction in deficit. That was clearly not enough. A month after that, we submitted the Stability and Growth Program with a bigger correction. We followed that with more measures, and every time we did that, even though most of these moves were greeted with satisfaction from our European partners, the markets kept not being convinced, for a number of reasons. So we ended up, by April, with spreads on an exponential course, and Greece being unable to service its debt obligations, and clearly against a very real prospect of bankruptcy. Now, throughout this period, there was a parallel process going on at the level of the European Union. The EU and the Eurozone, more particularly, discovering that indeed, as you correctly pointed out, what is, and what we knew from the very beginning as being an incomplete construction was actually proving the theoreticians right. In a common currency area where you have a severe asymmetric shock, you have to have the right tools to deal with it, and we didn't. And we were all scrambling to figure out which tools there were. Different countries were on different political calendars, different institutional backgrounds, very different attitudes and cultures. Thankfully, and I think this is a very important message for the strength of Europe and the Eurozone, just in time, literally, just in time, Europe came up with the EU IMF 110 billion package to help Greece based on very strict conditionality criteria, and followed that with the 750 billion European Financial Facility Fund. Remember, 30 billion from the IMF is 33 times the Greek quota, the biggest amount ever loaned by the IMF to any country. 110 billion is the biggest package ever for any country in the world. And we're talking about something that was scrambled together in a very short time period, which passed through every single European Parliament. And that is testament to the ability and the willingness of Europe to defend itself, even in extremes. Now, we are a few months down the road. Where are we? What's happened since then? Remember, this program has three main pillars: fiscal, structural, and one having to deal with the stability of the financial system. The fiscal pillar actually foresees an 11 percentage point correction in the deficit in a space of 4 years. Heavily front-loaded, half of that in the first year. 3 months hence, we are actually on track to achieve the target for 2010. We will actually, this year, do a bigger correction than one foreseen in the program. A correction exceeding 6 percentage points. This has never been done before. This is on the back of some very serious and very difficult decisions. Very hard decisions and some very big sacrifices made by Greek citizens. 15% reduction in nominal wages in the Greek public sector in 1 year. 10% reduction in pensions in both private and public sectors. 4 percentage point increase in VAT. 30% up excise taxes. Very serious reductions in operating expenditures in 1 year, exceeding 20–30%. Therefore, a very serious correction, mostly coming from the expenditure side and less so from the tax side. So on the fiscal front, even though nothing has been won yet, all indicators seem to suggest that we are on track, and we will continue to be on track. For this to be sustainable, the kind of fiscal measures that we took were complemented by structural fiscal measures. A new tax environment, a new tax law which was passed in April, to make the tax system not just more fair, but also much more effective, because we all know the extent of tax evasion in Greece. And a new budget law, what we call fiscal responsibility law, which is state-of-the-art, including expenditure ceilings, the standard contingency reserves, and a system whereby, for the first time, the finance minister has the ability to control spending in the entire general government sector, not just in the central government. But perhaps what is less understood is that the most important element of this 3-year economic program is actually the structural measures. Because the program is extremely ambitious on the structural front. And it is interesting to see that a few months after its inception, after its signing, we are delivering. Perhaps the biggest win has been the sweeping pension reform. Few people would have thought that Greece would have passed in such a short period of time such a radical pension reform, whereby now pensions are calculated based on lifetime earnings. Remember, the Greek, according to projections by the EU, liabilities would go from 12% of GDP to 24% of GDP for pensions by 2050 if we had left the system unchecked. We've now capped that to a few percentage points above 12%, at par with the European average. Next to the pension reform, biggest majority in Parliament. We started opening up closed professions. You all watched the situation with what we did with the trucking profession, where the government did not budge, did not stand down when it was faced with basically blackmail. And we are in the process, and it was voted in Parliament, to completely restructure the railway system that's losing about €1 billion a year and has an overall debt burden of roughly 10 billion, which is clearly not sustainable. Therefore, the structural reforms aspect is, to our mind, the most important, because next to initiatives to increase transparency, put more accountability, put all decisions involving expenditures on the internet for everyone to see, it changes fundamentally the way the state works. It unleashes the dynamism from the Greek economy, and it thereby will increase the growth potential of the country. The third pillar is the one that has to do with the financial system. Remember, Greece is exactly the opposite from Iceland and Ireland in that sense. The banks were very conservative. The banks never invested in toxic assets. They were never over-leveraged. Remember, private debt to GDP in Greece is one of the lowest in Europe as opposed to public debt. And the banks were victims, quote-unquote. It's hard to think of banks as being victims, but for the sake of the argument, to basically a sovereign debt crisis. And banks were very, very close to the edge, to the precipice, whereby a few days before we actually invoked the mechanism that was created at the European level, we were all wondering whether the situation and the capital flight that was happening, some of which coming to Cyprus, can we please have all that money back at some point? Where we were that close, we were really worried about the stability of the system. The system is stable now. We've had the biggest Greek bank, National Bank of Greece, with a tremendous capital increase in the national markets, 1.8 billion, which, including the sale of its subsidiary in Turkey and some other moves, would increase its capital ratio to one of the biggest in capital adequacy ratios, one of the biggest in Europe, among the top 5, 6 banks in Europe. So we are seeing a banking system which continues to be almost entirely dependent on the ECB, finally stand on its feet. This has been because of the progress done on the fiscal front. It's been because we have created a 10 billion financial stability fund as a safety net for these banks. And because there is a general perception that things are finally normalizing. When I visited the IMF a few weeks ago for the annual meetings, I have to tell you that it was a night and day difference between what was there about 4 months ago. 4 months ago, the general feeling was, you guys are a lost cause. Sooner or later, you will go bankrupt, and the EU is not going to be there for you. And even if it is, you still won't make it. I'm not claiming that these sentiments, the doomsayers, have completely disappeared. The Rubinis of this world are still around, and they will have to be proved wrong. However, the argument has shifted now. And the argument now is, well, can you stay the course? And at the end of the day, what is it exactly that makes your debt sustainable over the medium and long term? Can you stay the course is a political economy question. Remember, of all the European countries in fiscal trouble, Greece has the only government with a clear absolute parliamentary majority. It is the only government which is at the end of the first year of its first term. This is a world of difference with being in governments, in minority governments, or at the end of the second term, and being faced with elections. And at the same time, there is also a world of difference between the perception that a burning trash can is projecting on CNN and the reality in Greece. Those of you, and I'm sure there's many of you, that work or have done business or visit Greece often, see that actually compared with the pain that is being inflicted on the is remarkable the degree of support that the government continues to have. And this is for a very simple reason. It is quite well understood, despite the pain, that what we're doing is inevitable, is the only way to go about it, and we're actually trying to do it in the fairest way possible. So this brings me to the second question. Is this sustainable over the medium term? Well, the answer to that question is a very simple combination of sustainable primary surpluses and growth. And the real question is, what's the growth story for Greece in the following years? I think we begin to have a quite convincing story to that. Remember, Greece has been growing at very high growth rates for a long time, faster than the rest of the EU. Compared to other countries that are struggling with big fiscal deficits, we have had a much more robust and convincing growth pattern for many years. What we're actually doing now, the severe fiscal consolidation, is actually growth enhancing. Because growth depends on investment. Investment depends on financing. Financing depends on open capital markets. Capital markets open once credibility is back. And credibility is back when you're reducing your budget deficit. Secondly, the kind of structural reforms that are underway are a positive supply shock to the economy. And if you look at the way Greece is an outlier in most of the rankings, any sustainable improvement of this is bound to increase the underlying potential growth rate of the economy. And therefore, growth rates of around 3%, which are enough for a sustainable reduction in the debt-to-GDP ratio, are entirely achievable in the medium term. In fact, we are expecting growth to resume in positive numbers from 2012 onwards. This year, GDP will contract by around 4%. Next year, between 2.5 and 3, and then from 2012, we'll be back in positive numbers. And already there are a number of positive signs. Exports are picking up, new orders in industry are picking up, and business confidence is very, very carefully and delicately picking up, while still being in what is the worst time in terms of the crisis. Now, I will conclude with a few lessons, which at least I have learned, and I think have an interest beyond Greece. And they're very simplistic, so forgive me for that. Lesson number one, things tend to catch up with you. And this is important both for Greece and I think for Europe. Lax fiscal policy, weak institutions, eventually catch up with you. And they sometimes do it in the worst possible moment under the worst possible circumstances. And the markets are there with a vengeance. They're not logical, they're not rational. They underprice and overprice risk in different times, in different ways, but they're there and you depend on them. And as far as Europe is concerned, the holes that we knew were there during the construction of the euro eventually came back with a vengeance. And now we have to deal with it. Lesson number two, time costs money. Businesses know this very well. Sovereigns are beginning to learn this. The positive aspect is that Europe did rally in the end and came up with a solution. The negative is that it did take time. And time cost in terms of more turbulence. It's in a sense inevitable, given the way the Eurozone works and the fact that we make collective decisions based on very different starting points. And the fact that this discussion was called from the beginning from a problem with an attitude almost for a country that didn't seem to be paying attention to its obligations to the rest of Europe. And therefore, more time elapsed than was necessary before the decisions were taken. Finally, stopgap solutions are fine as a second best, but they're not good enough. We have a mechanism for Greece, we have a mechanism for Europe. It's now time to put together more permanent mechanisms. Crises recur. They come back in a different way. But if you don't correct the underlying fundamentals, they're bound to come back. And even if you do correct the underlying fundamentals, they may come back. There may be a point in the future where a country that does absolutely right still is in trouble. And then what do you do? And this is the discussion that's going on at the moment in Europe. This is a discussion that's been going not an easy discussion. But I do believe that it's a discussion that's going to confound the Eurosceptics, and there's many of them out there, that see the current troubles of the Eurozone as proof, positive, that this thing isn't working. Actually it is, and it's proven to be more robust than we thought. It's just that